different cost of productions. What's that?
That's actually a thing.
So is it like a law?
It's if a train's coming, so they know to stop it again.
But they're already stopped on there.
But like if they're fully on and a train's coming, they can't exactly go forward and back, so in that case they just go back.
And I guess that's quicker than like stopping like short of it.
Isn't there like flashing lights that says like a train's coming? Like they
Like a
just
lot
take
of
a
like in
gamble?
cities they have that, but like
Oh,
in like the countryside they don't.
you need to invest in that.
I have there's no real reason for it. It's like, I guess, tell if a train's coming, but like, why would you want to be in the middle of the track?
Like you definitely have a better view.
I understand, they have to open it up. It's like it's actually a law, they have to do that.
Just make the bus drivers
What?
get out instead.
What, but why though, on the middle of the track? Yeah, that's actually the law.
Okay, see, so I'm not
That's
crazy.
how you want it. Is they check it safe. Let's go in the middle of the most dangerous place for it. Check it safe.
I guess it's better than having like the kids like in the middle of the track.
Okay.
But still, the buses get hit. Good to know I wasn't going crazy this morning. So we're looking at these production costs of firms, trying to understand firm decision making. We're building up in the beginning. When I had 102 here in undergrad, we didn't cover like this entire chapter. I guess because there were no econ majors in the class. Even I wasn't one yet. So when I got to grad school, I literally just had like the cost curves. Like I had to memorize them on my own. So you were building up in the beginning, so you can kind of understand the relationship and what's going on behind these curves. So why the marginal cost curve slopes the way it does, why the average total cost curve, et cetera, et cetera. So remember from last time, we divide costs by whether or not they're variable. So we look at costs in the short run and the long run. In the short run, some of the costs are fixed. There's nothing we can do as a business. We're kind of stuck with them. But over the long run, you can change everything. Typically, it's going to be like your plant, your facilities. It's going to be fixed in the short run. Labor is going to be variable always in the short run. And then in the long run, everything's variable. In the long run, you can get out of your lease, you can expand your facilities, do whatever you want. Yeah, so we ended by looking at the marginal product of labor. Looked at the average total cost. So now we're going to calculate the marginal cost. I know you guys try to hold your excitement for like this marginal cost stuff. So we're going to define the marginal cost as a change in the firm's total cost from producing an additional unit of output. Because remember, firms are thinking on the margin. They're not thinking, am I going to produce 100 goods today? Am I going to make 100 pizzas to sell? It's, is it going to be worth it for me to make this next pizza? Can I recoup the cost of producing it by selling it? So basically here, we have a very simple formula. Marginal cost equals the change in total cost divided by the change in the quantity. Remember, delta in math is a symbol for change in. Most of the time when we're working in this class, the change in the quantity is going to be 1. That's typically what we're going to be working with. So we can ignore that and just look at the marginal cost is the change in the total cost, moving from one unit to the next. But it's important to remember the change in quantity is there in case you're looking for change in like over multiple units. You still want to get a habit of forgetting it. Kind of like hitting the snooze button in the morning. Makes it easier sometimes, but ends up biting you in the ass. Kind of like me this morning. So let's look at an example so we can like visualize what we're looking at here with marginal costs and how it compares to the average total cost. So we're going to go back to this production chart. We'll look at enough in this chapter to make your eyes bleed. So from here we have the first 2 workers. you move from 1 to 2, the marginal part of labor is increasing from 200 to 250. In this case, the marginal cost of pizzas is decreasing. And when you hire an additional worker, if they're more productive, again, the variable cost of adding that worker is going to be the same for each number of workers. So you end up with a lower marginal cost. Then as you start having decreasing marginal cost of labor, you end up with an increasing marginal cost. And you look at marginal cost compared to the average total cost, it's going down from unit 1 to 2 for both of these, and then they both start increasing again. So they're going to move together. So while we have this, the average total cost was more like a U shape, this marginal cost is going to look kind of like a Nike swoosh. In this case, it's kind of this extreme example where it jumps up there at the end. So it's going to decrease slightly at first, and then increase sharply. Yeah. So the reason we have these, both marginal cost and average total cost increasing after the second unit is because, again, we have these diminishing returns from workers. The marginal product of labor is decreasing. So production, it's increasing at a slower pace as we're adding more and more workers. And again, this is because we have this fixed capital. We have 2 pizza ovens in our restaurant. So as we add more and more workers, we're not adding more capital to this. So there's only so much additional pizzas they can add in this pizza shop because they're limited by these 2 ovens. Okay. So when a marginal part of labor is increasing, the marginal cost of output is falling. So we have the opposite relationship for these two. Now something else to note, as long as the marginal cost right here is below the average total cost is going to be decreasing. Then once the marginal cost passes the average total cost will increase. Now obviously as your marginal costs increase, so you're adding larger numbers, your average is going to go up. It's like a mathematical identity. And what we're going to see is that the marginal cost crosses the average total cost at its minimum point. That's going to come back into play later. Okay, so we've already calculated average total cost. Remember, total cost can be split into fixed cost and variable cost. So we can break this down a little bit more. We divide the total cost by the quantity, we get the average total cost, and we can break that into the average fixed cost, which is the fixed cost divided by the number of goods we're producing, and the variable cost, the average variable cost, which is variable cost divided by the quantity of output we're producing. So the average total cost equals the average fixed cost plus the average variable cost. Okay, so here we have them graphed. I know this seems boring, there's nothing to it yet. Once we start working with actual firm decision making, we'll get these real examples of what firms are trying to do and what these curves actually mean. And they'll make a lot more sense than just throwing 4 lines up there and talking about different points on them. But unfortunately, we need to build up in the basics so we actually know what the hell is going on when we get to those examples. So marginal cost has that Nike swoosh sign. It's labeled a little small, but here's your marginal cost. Then we have our average variable cost right here, average total cost, and average fixed cost. Now your average fixed cost is going to start high, and it's going to decrease over time because you're averaging that cost over more and more units of production. So in this example, the average fixed cost was what, $800 for the pizza ovens? So you have 800 divided by the number of pizzas you're producing. It's not going to change, so it's going to decrease more and more over time as you produce more and more pizzas. average variable cost is going to increase over time. Initially, it's going to drop because we have these more productive workers. That second worker is producing 250 pizzas, whereas the first worker is only producing 200 pizzas. So we're getting this increasing marginal product of labor. Then once that slows down, we get these diminishing returns. It's going to increase. So we're producing fewer and fewer pizzas per person, per worker. So it's going to increase. Now, if you add up the average fixed cost curve and the average variable cost curve, what we get here is the average total cost. Yes, and the marginal cost, not only does it cross the average total cost curve at its minimum, it's going to cross the average variable cost curve at its minimum. And when we're working with firms in different types of industries later, whether it's perfect competition or monopolistic competition, that's going to be important to remember because this marginal cost is going to help determine what level we're going to produce at. Okay, so this is looking at firms in the short run. Again, because we have this average fixed cost. In the long run, there's not going to be fixed costs. In this amount of time, it's long enough that all costs are variable. And based on the industry, based on the firm we're looking at, the long run is going to be a different amount of time. It could be weeks for a very simple business that doesn't have to deal with a long-term lease in a fixed location. Or it could be a very long time if you're looking at like, maybe something like an auto manufacturer, which has huge facilities and a lot of capital that they can't quickly purchase more of or get rid of some of theirs. But however long this period of time is that we're looking at the long run, there's going to be no distinction between fixed and variable cost. So in this case, we'll look at the long run average cost curve. That'll help show us the lowest cost where a firm's able to produce a quantity in the long run. Remember, because no outputs are fixed. That's all we're worrying about here is the long run average cost. So while firms are trying to maximize their short run profit, they've also have to be cognizant of what's going on in the long run, how much they're able to expand, and where the lowest costs of production are going to be in the long run. Because not just are they looking at, the next pizza or how many pizzas should I make tomorrow, it's also about like how many pizzas can I make in the long term. Should I expand my operations? Should I buy more capital to make the amount of pizzas I can sell greater? Should I open up a second pizza shop? For the Loretto example, probably shouldn't open up a second pizza shop in Loretto, but maybe in one of the neighboring towns. So long run average cost shows the lowest cost at which a firm is able to produce a given quantity of output in the long run. So again, when none of these inputs are fixed. So at low quantities, when firms aren't producing that much, they may experience what's called economies of scale. So that's when their long run average costs fall as they're increasing the quantity of output. So as they're producing more and more, the cost per unit is decreasing instead of increasing. So large firms are able to produce, often they can produce more cheaply than small firms. Sometimes it's because of these like large scale mechanical processes. Sometimes it's they're better able to organize themselves into more productive methods. A great example was Henry Ford's assembly line. He had a lot more employees, but each of them could focus on small specific tasks and move the car on to the next person. Do very small specific tasks. They get really good at that little task. Instead of having a couple people working on a car and building it from scratch. So because you have more people, you have more machinery, you actually lower your average total cost. Also, these large-scale businesses, they can buy in bulk. So think of Giant's produce, or it's not Giant around here, it's Martin's around here. Their produce is going to be cheaper than a place like Smith Myers because they can buy in bulk. They're buying larger quantities, so they're being charged less per unit because you have the higher fixed costs like delivery costs and things like that for Smith Myers. There's also administrative savings from spreading management costs around the business. So instead of having a manager for just like a couple employees, you end up having a manager for like 50 or 60 employees. Again, this helps lower the average cost because you're spreading it out more. So here we have an example of a small car factory. So say Tesla, and here's their average cost curve in the long run. And here's another one, say Ford, a larger automaker, their average total cost curve in the long run. You see, early on for Tesla, they can take advantage of economies of scale up to a certain point in a small factory. So early on, as they increase the quantity they produce, they can get a lower and lower average total cost. Eventually, they're going to hit the minimum. And from there, it's only going to increase their cost. Through the average total cost curve for Ford, for a larger auto manufacturer, for them, their minimum average total cost is going to be much lower. And their minimum efficient scale, so the number that is, it gives them that average total cost is going to be much larger than the small automaker. Economies of scale are most clear in the auto industry. That's a very good example of it because of how the high fixed costs of the industry. So in order to open up a brand new auto manufacturing, or let's just say a new automaker, like a whole new company, it's very expensive to get a giant plant because you need a large plant to be able to do that. You need a lot of capital investments, so a lot of different types of machines to help the assembly line process to actually produce it. There's a lot of technology involved with it. So it's not just people with screw guns anymore putting the car together. There's a lot of robotics involved and a lot of automation, and you need civil engineers and computer technician people to be able to deal with the technology. You need to buy a lot of raw materials in order to produce these cars. A lot goes into it, to just like each car. So because of that, we see very large economies of scale. So these large auto manufacturers are able to reduce their per unit cost considerably more than small auto manufacturers. That's why you don't see a lot of new entrants into the auto industry. And why you see a few large companies dominating the industry. The lowest level of output, where economies of scale are exhausted, is known as the minimum efficient scale. So that's where you take advantage of all economies of scale. You've taken advantage of your size as much as possible. At some point, growing larger isn't going to help you. At some point, growing larger just makes you more expensive, producing the goods more expensive. Likely before that, you experience a plateau. So you're not going to have just that minimum point and then a sudden increase. It'll be flat for a while. So we call that constant returns to scale. So as you're getting larger and larger, your average costs aren't decreasing at all. Your average costs are just staying the same. So despite the fact that you're able to increase output, you're not able to take advantage of decreasing average total costs like you were initially. Eventually firms hit that good size. Getting larger doesn't help. And eventually, firms can get so large, it's possible they experience diseconomies of scale. So what diseconomies of scale? I mean where a firm's long-run average costs begin increasing as they increase output. So the idea that there's this size that's good for a firm, if they're too far below that, it's too expensive to produce. And if you get too far above that, it gets too expensive to produce. Now, the diseconomies of scale. These might happen because as firm gets too large, it's difficult to manage them effectively. So worker productivity drops because you can't watch them all the time. Maybe they're slacking. Maybe they're just performing poorly and you don't catch it for a while because there's no one there, to catch it early. Maybe the firm has to employ workers, or they have to use other raw materials or machines that are less well suited to production. So the workers are more skilled at something else. They'd be better off working in another industry. They don't have skills to match whatever you're producing here. Maybe they start using materials that are more valuable in some other field, in some other production. So you have to bid up the cost of those, so it gets more and more expensive to produce more or to purchase more of those raw materials. Sometimes they just get too large and too bureaucratic. They get set in their ways, so they're unable to take advantage of cheaper production methods. So here's something I whipped up on Paint, super technical. Basically showing the different types without like multiple cost curves overlapping. So here early on, we see economies of scale. So the average cost is decreasing for the firm as they're growing larger and larger. They're able to take advantage of their size to reduce their costs enough that their average cost is going down. At Q1 here, at some certain point, they hit constant returns to scale. So as they get larger and larger, they're not able to improve, not able to lower their average cost, but they're still able to operate efficiently and effectively. And then at some point way out here, at Q2, they start experiencing diseconomies of scale. They're now so large that they're hard to manage, that they're bloated, that they're using resources that aren't well suited, that they're just being managed poorly in general, possibly. So, looking specifically at automobile factories and at the automotive industry, a car company might experience economies of scale because their production might increase at greater than the proportional rate as inputs increase. At greater? Sounds like a typo. I don't know what they're going for there. Greater than. So as you use more inputs, so say you're using more workers or you're using more capital, you're able to increase production at a greater rate than what you're putting in. So you've now got, so you add more workers, and instead of, you double the number of workers, instead of doubling production, you're able to say triple production because the workers are able to specialize on certain tasks, making them more productive. Or maybe the capital you're adding, if you're doubling the amount of capital, you can like triple or quadruple how much you're able to produce. Again, because you're using this new production technology, this new process of production and new machinery you can use. A good example is just going from, initially when they made automobiles, they'd have a team of a couple people working together and basically building the car from scratch, like putting it all together themselves. Henry Ford was the first to say, hey, why don't I have everyone focus on a few specific tasks and just move it on to the next person? So when Ford did that, when he changed the whole layout of the factory, added all this capital, building the assembly line itself, they experienced economies of scale, massive economies of scale at this point. They became far more productive than the capital that they were adding. Another thing is large firms can purchase inputs at a lower price. We've seen people get large discounts for large orders. They sell at a much lower cost per unit than when you buy a smaller amount. But again, eventually economies of scale die out. They're not going to last forever. It's very difficult to run huge operations to manage these massive companies. And we see a lot of companies that were, say, startups that were small companies 100 years ago. They grew over the 1900s to be like some of the largest, most successful firms in the country. And then over the past 20 to 30 years, they've been struggling, they've been bloated, and they've gone bankrupt, or they've had to spin off other industries or other lines of production that weren't being effective. So the president of Toyota's Georgetown plant had a good quote. He said, "Demand for high volume saps your energy. Over a period of time, it erodes your focus and thins out the expertise and knowledge painstakingly built up over the years." It just highlights what happens with this economies of scale. That this large output over a long period of time, eventually you get these economies of scale. It becomes harder and harder to produce, harder to manage, harder to keep talent there. So things end up becoming more and more expensive. Okay, so remember we talked about the Coase theorem last chapter. Ronald Coase had another idea, and he talked about the size of the firm. He developed one of the first theories of the firm. At the time, he was a young socialist, and he was studying economics, and he looked at firms, and he's like, if the market is so great, why don't people just do all their job on the market? Why don't they all work as independent contractors, get some material, get some intermediate good from someone else, do a little bit of labor to it, and then sell it to someone else to do. They could do that just as effectively as working for a company. And they don't have to deal with like a terrible boss bitching them all day. They can work the hours they want to work. So why do people do this? Why do we end up with these? We have this free market where we have all these firms able to choose what to produce, but the firms themselves are like a centrally planned economy. Everyone's told what to do, rather than people figuring out on their own, people experimenting. So in his mind, the manager or the CEO ends up being like the central planning board that economists say don't have enough knowledge, they don't have the expertise, they're missing something. If central planners are like that, why aren't these CEOs and managers considered like that? So his answer was transaction cost. Obviously, like the Coase theorem was heavily involved in transaction cost. He said there's transaction costs, which is why firms exist. So you're not going to purchase goods on the market. You see a couple of your guys' eyebrows went up, like, what the hell are you talking about? It's so difficult to go out there, purchase some good half-made, do a little bit of work to it. Maybe now it's like 3/4 of the way ready to be used, and then sell it to someone else to finish off. It's going to be very time-consuming to find someone who's producing those intermediate goods that you have the expertise to to help out in the production process before you sell to someone else, and then finding that other person. Maybe you have to rent a place or like build a workshop. Like, it's very difficult to try to figure this out. So when there's these transaction cost presence, we just organize into firms, and that makes the whole thing easier. Lowers transaction costs enough that all you have to do is focus on your job and go in. That's why we organize these firms. So we said when firms grow larger, they reduce the average total cost because of economies of scale. But eventually that efficiency is going to disappear. Another thing that your textbook doesn't mention that increases the cost is just the cost of organizing the firm and organizing the production process. You have these increasing costs of management as you need more and more layers of management. So at first you get these economies of scale because, say, you have a small place, you have 6 workers and 1 manager. As you grow larger and larger, maybe you have now 60 workers and 1 manager. And you're producing more, so that 1 manager spread out over more people, spread out over more goods. But eventually, as companies get larger and larger, you get mid-level managers. You get several different layers of management going up. So now you're adding cost again. And you think about it, you need the manager at different levels to agree with each other. So you have all these meetings, all these discussions trying to figure out what's best, what course of action we should go. So think of this as transaction costs, the cost of trying to reach an agreement. And eventually the bureaucracy grows and it stifles innovation within the firm. And it gets very costly to run these large firms. My mom used to work for St. Jude Medical, which is like a smaller medical device firm. They had like maybe 2,000 to 3,000 employees, and they had a lot of freedom to operate within St. Jude Medical. They got bought out by Abbott Laboratories. Abbott Laboratories is enormous, tens of thousands of employees, and they've got a very rigid bureaucracy that not all the employees have to operate within. They have all these different requirements they have to do, which adds time, it adds money, and then if they have an idea, they have like a new lead, they have to run it up through the management and get their like permission for it, rather than just going and acting on it like St. Jude had. Because it was smaller, more management knew more of the workers, so if there's a medical device rep that has an idea to sell to a new hospital, they say, oh, like, all right, you can go for it, without having to worry or have to pitch it to them. There's this trust because there's like the knowledge between them. Whereas when you get larger bureaucracies, because the managers don't know who's working under them, they end up having to set up these rigid rules. Which is good, it prevents bad things from happening, but it also prevents a lot of good things from happening. And it makes it much more expensive to try to convince someone way up the food chain to accept your new idea than it is for these smaller firms where they just have the freedom to go out and do it. And it's also costly to manage these firms if they grow larger and larger and have more and more lines of business. So GM had several different nameplates that they were working with back in like the 2000s, and they cut off some of them. So they ended Oldsmobile, they ended Pontiac. Because it was difficult managing, 6, 7 different lines, they cut it down to like 4 or 5 now. Other places like GE, or even, the other guys, Lindell Global, and their slogan is "We are in everything." Very difficult when you have all these different types of industries. GE was in just about everything, even though they started manufacturing appliances. Very difficult to coordinate between all these businesses, or all these lines of your business, when they're all focused on totally different things. So management doesn't have this expertise in all these different lines. So you need a ton of different managers. Again, just weighing down the cost and the difficulty of decision making, especially for the company as a whole. When the CEO wants to take the company in a new direction or wants to focus on something different, you've got all these meetings, all this time it takes to reach an agreement. Those transaction costs. So basically there's an optimal size to firms where they minimize the cost of production and helps them maximize their profitability. That size is not a monopoly, not in a competitive market. There's a lot of fears. If you watch BoJack Horseman, they joke about what do you call it? Walmart, Amazon, Apple, GlaxoSmithKline. Like they just jokes about companies getting bigger and bigger, and you're going to end up with a couple monopolies. But because of the problem with transaction costs and the diseconomies of scale that firms have to deal with, we're not going to see companies reach that sort of size. In fact, companies like GE have been shedding lines and breaking up and getting smaller and smaller over the past decade. So there's a point that you reach where it becomes too expensive to operate. You become too bloated and too inefficient, and smaller firms are able to rise up and outcompete you. So I guess the whole point of that little rant at the end was just you don't have to worry about one monopoly taking over the entire economy at some point in the future. You've got transactions costs, you have economies of scale that are going to prevent them from getting so large, putting everyone else out of business or buying everyone else up. Okay, here we have some definitions of the cost formulas for you to keep in mind. You need to study them. So last question I have for you guys. Do NFL teams behave efficiently? What's the goal of an NFL team? Win? Generate revenue? Put on the show, all right. I guess it depends on who you're looking at within the organization, right? So the owner's gonna say usually maximize revenue. The coach or the GM is gonna say to win. The fans are gonna say to win. There's definitely a relationship between the two though, right? Odds are the more you win, the more revenue you're gonna generate. Unless you're like the Pirates, right? And you just try to maximize revenue and pay your, like any high-priced player, you just let them go and trade them for prospects, right? I'm not a baseball guy, but I know a lot of Pens fans or Pirates fans that bitch about that. So when NFL teams are trying to decide if they should bring in a bunch of veterans, you can tell that's out of date. The Buccaneers should be Tom Brady. Do you bring in Tom Brady, or do you draft a rookie? So the teams are, if they're optimizing, if they're trying to maximize revenue, trying to maximize their wins subject to total cost, two different ways to look at it. But either or, they should, the marginal productivity, so I guess the marginal wins brought by veterans and by rookies should be about equal. Some economists looked at this and found that teams are overspending on high draft picks. This was before the rookie salary cap. You guys remember how many years ago the rookie salary cap was? It had been a long time ago. Wasn't Cam Newton the first year, the new rookie cap? Like a bunch of college players left college a year early, even though they took a hit to their draft spot. Like they would have been able to get drafted higher in the first round, but they'd have made less money because of the new cap that came in. So before, teams could just basically pay what they wanted. It was usually based on what the previous year was, but it would like slowly go up over time. And NFL general managers were getting overconfident in their picks, and they were also trying to outbid the previous year to get the player excited to go there. So they ended up overpaying these rookies and underpaying veterans, which is kind of hard to imagine because now we think of it as overpaying. Like, anyone know how much the Bucs are paying Tom Brady this year?
Too much.
Yeah, so you think of them throwing a ton of money at veterans at the very end of their career because they had such a great career, and underpaying rookies. But they actually found the opposite, that they underpay rookies, or overpaid rookies, and underpaid vets at the end of their career.
I mean, watching the football team, we always think that's all the time. You know?
But they went through that one period where they traded their draft picks every single year and tried to build through the free agency.
We got Deion Sanders at the end of his career. I mean, Adrian
Throwback.
Peterson did something. We love getting old veterans who are with us.
That was Arizona Cardinals' thing for years.